One sec. Okay, welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop, our first of the fall 2016 season. Christian's not yet with us. We're hoping he's coming. We're expecting him. We're a relatively small group today, so we've got a lot of opportunity to give Luke feedback on his paper, and Omar is going to get us started. So let me turn it over to Omar.
Great. Well, thanks, Will, for inviting me. And it's my first time, so I'm still unfamiliar with what the norms are. So if I overstep any norm boundaries, just let me know. But I love the concept. I wish I'd known about it sooner. I would have participated in ones that you had organized previously. I think it's a great idea.
Wonderful.
Okay. So I thoroughly enjoy reading the paper. It's nice to get an invitation to I enjoyed it, and I recognize the literature. It's always nice to also be cited. It certainly makes you happy when you see your own name up there in the paper. So enough said. I think it's a fantastic paper. You cited me. Go ahead and publish. More seriously, though, Luke, you're asking a really important question. How do opposition groups in Africa overcome the collective action dilemma and mobilize large numbers of people in ethnically diverse settings? And your answer is one that is very intuitive, that they use the symmetry of a food price shock to frame issues cross-ethnically. And this just makes a lot of intuitive sense. And you go about trying to demonstrate that this is in fact what is going on here. And it speaks to a large number of theories. And it's a wonderful theory section at the beginning. You speak to the social movement, contentious politics literature. You go down the route of the little bit to the framing literature, the ethnic mobilization literature, and the nonviolence resistance literature, which has taken off in the last few years since the Arab Spring. So you've touched on a number of really important and topical theories and ideas. So I don't think you'll have much trouble justifying the relevance of the paper. And you've got a sophisticated research design, empirical strategy. You're doing this across Africa. You're using standardized grid cells to solve the problems of administrative boundary changes. And I thought that your regression model was defensible with a good set of controls. Okay, so enough on all the things that I loved about the paper. So things that I think that you could do to improve the paper. These are organized very roughly. So maybe I just kick off with two of the big questions that I think you should devote some time in the paper attempting to answer in anticipation of that reviewer number 3, who is going to come back and ask these questions, I'm sure, anyway. So the first is, it's about an assumption, right, which is implicit in your third hypothesis, which is your core hypothesis. And this is the one that says that, we would expect to see that food price shocks have an effect in ethnically diverse areas, which is counterintuitive given the challenges of collective action in ethnically diverse settings, right? So the assumption here that I think you've got to justify is that what's going on in those grid cells that are ethnically diverse is in fact mobilization across ethnic lines, because it's entirely possible that what's going on is that within those ethnically diverse grid cells, it is just one or two ethnic groups that are doing all the mobilizing, because I don't believe you've got the data that allows you to disaggregate which groups are participating in those nonviolence resistance events. I know you exclude events which are coded as ethnic, but it doesn't mean, though, that necessarily that the events are multi-ethnic or cross-ethnic. So you need to spend some time, I think, justifying that. That's a big one.
Yeah.
And related to this is another biggish question, and this is more to do with the interpretation of your coefficient. So you're looking at, in the model, the third hypothesis at an interaction term, right? This is a rare events logistic regression, and it's the interaction between food price shocks and ethnic diversity, which I assume, are you measuring this as like a fractionalization measure? Is that how diversity is measured?
It's basically, so in terms of diversity, so I'm looking at excluded groups based on the EPR data.
Okay.
And how many, so it's basically grids where there's more than one group in a grid.
Okay, so it's the number of groups in a grid. So you interact the number of groups in a grid with food price shocks. Okay, so this is one of these things where you have to go, I have to take myself back to like my graduate level statistics class and try to remember how you interpret interaction effects. So if I remember rightly, and please somebody save me if I've got this utterly wrong, Will, please, for making a fool of myself, but just to make sure, the interpretation of the interaction effect here would be that the effect on the likelihood of non-violent resistance is higher. So the effect of food price shocks on non-violence resistance is higher at higher levels of ethnic diversity than at lower levels of ethnic diversity. So let me just say that again, because I think the interpretation is really crucial here. The interpretation of your interaction effect is that at higher levels of ethnic diversity, we would expect to see a stronger effect of food prices on non-violence resistance. A contrario, at lower levels of ethnic diversity, we would expect to see a smaller effect of food prices on the likelihood of non-violence resistance. So think through for a moment the logic of this, because it is a little counterintuitive, and it makes me wonder whether the interaction term coefficient is the right one to be using to test your hypothesis here, because the logic, the causal logic, the theoretical logic should be that in more ethnically homogeneous areas, we would expect to see food prices having a stronger effect on the likelihood of non-violence resistance. But in fact, your coefficient is in fact suggesting the opposite. Now, what to do about it, okay? Well, the first thing I think to do is, I think just again, this is basic for me, remembering graduate level statistics, you do need to include the main effect, right? You don't actually have, or do you have the diversity variable in the model itself? You can't have an interaction term and have only one of the two terms as a main effect in the model. You need to have both. So you need to have the diversity term in there, which perhaps you do, and it's named something that I didn't quite recognize. But if it is there and you're still finding this effect, then it is counterintuitive, and you would need to spend some time explaining why it is you're getting this particular effect. Okay, so well, I know you told me you're going to talk for 5 minutes, and I can easily talk for much, much longer.
Let's actually pause there, because
those two big ideas,
and ask to come back, and because I think, well, for two different reasons. One, give Luke a chance to respond, and I could have a follow-up. And one thing I failed to do when I first got us started here was remind everybody that at any moment, if you've got a new idea that we're not currently discussing that you want to bring up, just try to get up in front of your camera and get my attention, and I'll put you in the one finger queue. But if you're thinking, oh, I've got something to contribute to the current discussion, hit up 2 and I'll get you with 2 fingers. There's so few of us that the queue may not be terribly important, but that's how that works. So let's kick it to Luke and give you a chance to respond to that.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Omar, for taking the time to read the paper. I really appreciate it. And thank you for 2 really valuable comments. The first point, so the assumption that this is kind of an intergroup protest and food prices is one of potential mechanisms to unify restrictions. Okay, yeah, I completely take this point in terms of, so it's very difficult to capture at the subnational level the diversity, especially with the EPR data, because it's mainly based on kind of so where groups predominantly reside. So it's not really capturing kind of other groups that reside in the same area potentially. So I've found that quite problematic to try and capture that. So the variable that I have is basically a dummy variable of whether there is at least 2 or more groups in an area, or where these kind of settlement, ethnic settlement areas overlap. So I think you're right. I don't have the data to split between.
And Luke, what's that variable called?
I just call it diversity. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just call it diversity. So areas with at least 2 groups or more.
And sorry, Luke, is that variable in the model as a main effect then?
For the third hypothesis, I don't think it is in the model, but I have run it. I have run other models with it in, and the results are the same. Yeah, I mean, I'm finding the third hypothesis very tricky, and also the kind of how to capture these kind of diverse areas. I'm finding that very tricky. But so basically, in the last week, I've kind of moved forward, both in terms of thinking about how to frame the paper, and this relates to the other point that you had, where I don't have the data to distinguish between whether these are kind of intergroup or group-based kind of protests. I mean, the data is just simply not there. So it could be one group mobilizing to engage in action. I think that's perfectly plausible. So in one section of the paper, I talk about how larger groups have a higher mobilization potential. And there's some recent research that's is either out or is coming out, which basically finds larger groups do have a mobilization advantage over smaller groups. So I think I want to reframe it in that it could be an ethnic-based protest, because I can't distinguish between the two, and that larger groups, they struggle less with getting more numbers on the street, which is one of the key goals. But in terms of the second point that I make, in terms of trying to draw other groups in order to have a wider cost on the government with larger groups, this is problematic, and this is where we're likely to get the kind of intergroup, more likely to get the intergroup protests. So I think the mechanism can work either way, because ethnic groups are not not monolithic. There is divisions within ethnic groups as well. So the EPR data actually codes, and I like the example of South Africa, where you have the black group during the apartheid era. You have a large group, 85% of the population. They're clearly not going to have trouble mobilizing large numbers, but they do have divisions within this group. And then this is actually subsequently in the EPR broken down into the COSA, etc. So I think I want to reframe the paper to theoretically reflect that there could be divisions within groups, and food prices can help these groups overcome that. And also when there's collaboration across groups, so what we saw in Kenya in the early 90s, with the kind of coalition with the party there. So I think it can work different ways, and I can't capture that empirically. So I think that needs to be in the theory and framed in that way. I mean, if you guys have any comments on that, I would really appreciate any feedback.
Yeah.
Omar, is that one for a new direction or follow up?
No, follow up. So what should I put up for follow up? 2 fingers. Okay, so yeah, I was going to suggest, so it's easy to kind of say where the gaps are in the paper. So the hardest thing is how do you plug the gaps, right? So you have scattered throughout the paper lots of examples, suggestive examples of the mechanism at the causal logic at work, and some which even go further and try to suggest the mechanism at work. So one way to increase the plausibility of your causal logic is to deepen these examples. Find one that or find two that make a lot of sense. They could be, I don't know how you want to call them, shallow case studies, but something that allows people to see that the logic that you're suggesting is at work is indeed what's going on. So if it is cross-ethnic mobilization, let's have an example of how a food price shock led to cross-ethnic mobilization. And related to that, it probably isn't such a great idea to start with the Burundian example because, well, two reasons. One, because that isn't in response to a food price shock. And secondly, Burundi is unlike Rwanda, a much more post-ethnic society at this point, and the largest cleavage is probably intra-Hutu than it is Hutu-Tutsi at this point, at least until the last 18 months or so. So lead with another example, and then maybe you could deepen it in the paper.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that as well. So I'm not finding my notes terribly clearly here. So when you're saying the third hypothesis, it's labeled H2B, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I'm not messing up there. So I was thinking as I was reading two things. One, I thought Omar's question earlier about how exactly have you coded this? It's not clear. I had the same reaction. So that's just one of the things is to more clearly explain when you actually get to the assignment of values to your variables. I wasn't sure about how that was done. But then backing up to the argument, it seems to me that in your example of South Africa, it's interesting that you picked it because that's the one that was bouncing around in my head as well. That whether or not we expect a group to be able to amass large numbers depends on its proportion of the population, right? So I'm trying to find, I know I wrote this down somewhere. Oh, here we go. Okay, so page 6 is where I first started thinking about this. You write, this is the very top of page 6, ethnic hierarchy and contestation is likely to negatively impact nonviolent mobilization in two key ways. First, undercutting social networks and other available mobilizations. Second, degrade the ability of opposition leaders to bring together diverse groups. Right off the bat in presenting your argument, you're assuming that none of the groups are large enough to actually amass the kind of pressure that nonviolent protest needs. And I began wondering, well, in the grid cells, how often is that true? Aren't there grid cells where a large group of people are, I don't know, maybe you can have 40 or 60 or 80% of one particular ethnic group. And so whether we're thinking at the grid cell level or not, because at this point we don't have to, I know that's kind of an operational decision. But we're definitely thinking subnationally, which is awesome. But it seemed to me that the ratio of, so for instance, if I've got an area, a geographic area where I have 8 groups, the largest, 8 groups that are excluded, the largest of which is 10% of the population, your argument really holds strongly there. But if I've got one excluded group and there's 60% of the population, not so much. And then on the bottom of page 7, you write, in other cases, ethnic groups may be sufficiently large enough to meet participation thresholds or may be numerically dominant in certain regions. Right? So you're aware of this too. But I think in developing the theory, what I would encourage you to do, presenting, is actually introduce in some way this idea of to me, it's got two dimensions, and I don't quite know how to wrap my head around it. I think this is always one of the hard things in talking about cleavages, whether they're ethnic or any other. We're interested in sort of how many are there, and then what's the portion of like the largest? I mean, not only that, right? But that seems to be the easiest way to think about it. It seems to be how you're going. And then, of course, are they excluded or not, right? So I think your argument's actually more complex or richer, whichever way you want to describe that, than you're currently making it, and that ends up playing out in some of the empirical, kind of coding decisions and stuff. Does that seem to make sense?
Yeah, it does. I agree. I mean, I do control for the size of groups within a grid, how big the groups are. I can't remember exactly. I don't think there's some of them.
And that wasn't. And so I was trying to think about how that works, because I want to encourage you to think about that more in the theoretical part, so that it's not just a control; it's actually an important part of it. And are you coding at the grid cell the size of the largest group?
Yes. Yeah.
And so, and this kind of goes back to some of what Omar was talking about. So I'm trying to think through. Is your argument that when that group is of a certain size, whatever that is, or as it gets larger, the impact of food price should be lower on nonviolent protests? In other words, the incentive or the impact of nonviolent protest should be highest when you have a relatively small excluded group that, in order to leverage that tactic, needs to mobilize with others, and food price shock creates that sort of focal point mobilization opportunity that makes nonviolent a more viable tactic. Is that, and if so, the story I just told is one about that, not about population not being a control variable, but actually having an effect as an interaction. Okay,
I'm not actually arguing that. I can certainly look into that. And I've been very aware of kind of size of groups, because that's one of the, as I say, there's work that's going to be coming out on that, where they do find larger groups have higher mobilization potential. But I think what I'm truly trying to argue is that there's a different nature, with regards to non-violence and how it mobilizes.
Okay.
And the first is you need, to be successful and for it to be viable, you need mass numbers to engage on the streets in protests or in strikes or sit-ins. And the reason being because it's basically fundamental. We know that larger, from work from Erica Chenoweth and others, that the more people engage, the more likely it is to be successful. So that's the first crucial element to non-violence. And opposition groups know that they need mass numbers.
Yeah.
So that's the first kind of issue. And naturally, if there's divisions in society, that can undermine that. However, with larger groups, then this is not going to be as much of an issue, and I accept that. But the second element, violence, is not just mobilizing mass numbers, but it's how non-violence attempts to hurt the government in order to force concessions. And this is the bit where it changes, where I think group size is less important. And basically it's because different groups will hurt the government in different ways. Different groups will have, say, different work in kind of different jobs, etc. And so basically, going back to the example of South Africa, I mean, everything that you're saying about group size, you know, why did they just mobilize together and continue to mobilize together and engage against the apartheid regime? Why did they, you know, seek help from the Asian community, which is really, really small? But it's how the Asian community has a different relationship to the state. It has different the people have different kind of occupations, and you know, if you're gonna. I hope I'm explaining this well enough, but you're going to increase the cost, and the costs are going to be wider. So I think that's why, you know, in South Africa they were appealing across group lines in order to impose costs. So I think even in case where sorry.
Yeah, no, okay, so this comes up on page 8.
Yeah.
And I actually drew a line across the page on my copy when you get to the sentence, bringing together different groups, and I jotted in the margin, hold on, this is a brand new paragraph. You're talking about something new here. And notice how it's kind of tacked on. And I think from listening to you, and I was like, this seems relevant, but it's not talking about a different process that's not integrated in. But now I think I understand what you're trying to do with it. So I think that paragraph and what you're talking about right now needs to be featured more strongly. You know, I mean, I can run with the story you're telling, and it might be a little different, right? But I forget what city it was, but there was a city in South Africa where you know, getting a bunch of shop owners, targeting them and then getting them involved, and there was it was a black boycott of shop owners, which then brought pressure on the regime, and I think a lot of the shop owners were Asian, and then using that pressure to then bring them onto, which then got them to start to partner to end the boycott, and then partner to pressure the regime. It's a little different than your story, but the point is they ended up forming an alliance with a very small group that had a lot more leverage, right? And so to the extent that that's part of what's going on, which makes a lot of sense to me, I don't think it's given adequate attention in the current manuscript. I'm not sure, and maybe some of the others can comment on this as well, I'm not sure how well you're going to actually turn to data sources. But maybe you can. I mean, I don't know what you can know at the grid level. Because it's not, here we're now not just talking about the largest group, right? We're talking about groups with different, for instance, I mean, this would just be one possible characteristic, but different places in the economic hierarchy, right? But it says I mean, I think the logic is straightforward, and I find it compelling that I would tell it a little differently than you do, but I think of it as, oh, there's this focal point that leaders of several different groups can see, oh, my people are affected by this, and whether they coordinate or not, you're going to get the potential of large numbers because of this food price shock that you don't get when the issue of deprivation that, as you point out, can target the state is doesn't cut across the cleavages.
Yeah. I totally agree. I really don't. I mean, I've read through the paper in the last week, and I'm in the process of making a new draft. So all these comments are absolutely spot on, and I completely agree. I think I definitely agree. It's not clear enough in the paper, and the way that I've framed the paper at the moment is not adequately getting at what I'm really trying to show here. So I completely agree. That needs more work, and what you've just brought up. I mean, I think I need to focus more on this being a cross-cutting issue. Around cross-cutting issues and I need to draw this out a lot more. It's interesting. Yeah, I think I'll leave that there.
I saw
yeah.
Omar had a two-finger.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to pause because I've spoken a lot. But Kim, did you want to say something before I go further?
So I guess I can add to something that Luke just said, or I guess following up on Will as well, about this idea of what's actually cross-cutting and what's not. So I think when you start talking about all these other issues like economic growth or lower economic growth, and you write those off as asymmetric, so you're testing this at what I think is the subnational level. Well, you're testing it at the subnational level, and I think you have a sentence somewhere later that kind of says, well, things like natural disasters might be are really concentrated in one area, so you're most likely not going to see a lot of ethnic groups. But I would like to see that more towards the beginning and explicitly saying, like, why is that not a cross-cutting thing? Because you kind of just, in that, where you talk about it, you're just focusing on the symmetric versus asymmetric. And I think that changing that language and developing it as cross-cutting versus not cross-cutting will really help that section out a little bit.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good point. So my impression of trying to synthesize the feedback you're getting so far is that there are multiple ways you could interpret your results, the data that you have, and the story that you tell. The causal process or the causal mechanism at work is very hard to be able to demonstrate using quantitative data. And you can have a very rich theory section as you do and make a very strong case for your particular story. But as Will has indicated, you could tell a slightly different story. For me, the best way to get to this is, as I've already said, is to have a case or two in depth to suggest that what you're arguing for the causal process is indeed what is at work here. So that there is indeed cross-ethnic mobilization in response to a food price shock. So where I wanted to take the conversation was to think through the causal logic and the observable implications of your logic, right? And Will has hinted at least one of those observable implications. So, and there were at least two, possibly three, that I thought of here that may be more interesting as hypotheses than hypotheses 1 and 2, which I think are largely self-evident. Hypothesis 3 is really your crucial one, but I think you possibly have a hypothesis 4 and 5 that might be interesting to test here. So the first observable implication, Will hinted at this as well, is that you would expect different responses depending on the characteristics of the particular groups that you're facing. So, for instance, you would expect wealthier groups not to be as affected by a food price shock as a poorer group, simply because they can afford to absorb the shock better than a poorer group would. So that is one observable implication that you might well indeed be able to test, and if indeed true, would lend support to your causal logic. A second observable implication is related to that, which is, though I suspect you're not going to have this kind of data, would be to do with within group inequality. Because you would expect that a group that is relatively egalitarian with relatively low levels of inequality. So in other words, there are not so many people who are very rich. There are very few people who are very rich and very few people who are very poor. There's kind of a big middle. You would expect the effect to be stronger for a group with a low level of within group inequality as well. Again, reinforcing the causal logic about the mechanism at work here. Though I suspect you're not going to have at the grid level. I don't know. I know that, what's the name? Gudrun Ostby at is it Uppsala or Prio? I can't remember where she now, but I know she has created a data set with between group inequality at the subnational level. I just have never looked at it. But if it's a usable data set for this. This is, again, a really interesting observable implication that could potentially be a hypothesis that would be a contribution to the literature. But let me just pause there and stop and say that there's to think through some of the observable implications, because I really feel that the first two hypotheses, you spend a lot of time. Well, let me just tell you what I think of them. The first hypothesis, it's not really a hypothesis, because we kind of already know that, where we would expect that to be the case, that we would expect to see resistance to food price shocks, to protest to food price shocks. The secondary literature, the primary literature all confirm this. It's nice that you can confirm this at the kind of across Africa at some subnational level, but it's not the greatest contribution of your paper. So you're kind of already saying what we already know. The second hypothesis may actually, one possible interpretation, it may actually go against your logic. And so I would consider reframing it or dropping it altogether, because your second hypothesis runs thus. You're saying that, again, it's an interaction term, that in areas where you have ethnically excluded groups, that the effect of food prices will be higher on nonviolent resistance. Okay, this is true. This does not get to your argument about how it supports cross-ethnic mobilization, because this is ethnic mobilization, not cross-ethnic mobilization that you're testing. And someone who sees that hypothesis and looks at your data, that what you're in fact doing here is reinforcing one of your alternate theories, which is resource mobilization theory. Because the reason why you see that in opposition areas a stronger effect of food prices is because they have pre-existing networks, resources, as it were, that explains why it's easier for them to mobilize. And you have framed your paper as a challenge to structural theories, political opportunity, and resource mobilization theory. You're focusing on a catalyst or a trigger theory. And so someone who would look at hypothesis 2 and find that you in fact validate it might say you're actually vindicating resource mobilization theory here, because it's the fact there are these pre-existing network resources, political parties, movements, whatever they are, in these areas that explains why the effect is higher in those ethnically excluded areas than in the ethnically included areas. Okay, so let me just pause there and let you digest it, because that's a lot to take on.
Okay, can I respond?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's a lot to take on board. Right, so I'll try and start from the top. So in terms of other implications, so the first one is different responses to wealthier and poorer groups. Okay, yeah, intuitively that's where I actually started. I thought that poorer groups would actually suffer more than wealthier groups, because poorer groups have to assign a higher percentage of their income to higher prices. So that's where the paper kind of started, and I literally found no evidence of this happening. And I think that the reason why is because of what I'm trying to argue is that the effect, it affects all kind of consumers, regardless of whether they're rich or poor. I do think it affects poorer people more, but in terms of middle class people, although it may affect their income less, they potentially have a higher kind of mobilization potential. And this is what we saw in Egypt, where one of the crucial aspects is that food prices, even before the Arab Spring, wheat prices skyrocketed, and you had people from all different social backgrounds engaging on the street, and including Arabs and Coptic Christians and etc. So yeah, I mean, it was people from all different economic backgrounds, as well as kind of intergroup kind of backgrounds. So although I agree that poorer people would be affected more, I think they're less likely to protest than kind of middle class people. I think there's something going on there, and that's probably why I haven't found any evidence. And then, so I kind of hope that answers that kind of first point, but it does feed into this intra-ethnic aspect. which I totally agree. Okay, so I'm actually thinking of future research to look at intra-ethnic differences because it's not really been covered in the literature. So at the moment, I'm not sure, with the limited space that's available in these papers, I'm not sure I can really incorporate it at this point, but it's definitely something I'm going to look to in the future in terms of, and when I mean intra-ethnic, so class divisions within groups. So yeah, I've already thought about using kind of economic data across Africa and coming up with some sort of wealth estimate and then seeing the differences between groups, so that the economic aspect, and then also kind of identities that ethnic lines. So there could be different religions within an ethnic group. There could be different there could be different languages within an ethnic group, and I think there's recent EPR data from, I think it's Niels Bohrman, who's started to look at within groups. But the other aspect to that is there could be two groups that share, or parts of two groups that share a similar religion or share a similar kind of language. So in terms of these linguistic or religious differences within groups, that could actually it could actually be a, sorry, I'm getting confused with the different kind of terminologies. It could be a cross-cutting cleavage itself, and I'm keen to explore that at a later date. So for example, I hope this is clear, but I'll use an example. So in Nigeria, so you have at least around half of the Yoruba are actually Muslim. And we know that majority of Hausa and Fulani in the north are Muslim. So perhaps that affinity along religious lines can help them two groups coordinate, and I'm sure it does, and I'm keen to explore that. So I hope that answers the kind of second point. In terms of the hypothesis, I generally just think, looking back, I think they're problematic. I think what I'm trying to do is really have one hypothesis, because there's only one mechanism at work here. I think there needs to be one hypothesis where basically expect in these really difficult, multi-ethnic societies, we'd expect food prices to increase the risk of non-violence when otherwise it's really difficult to do so. And I think the three different hypotheses is pretty much the three ways that I'm trying to test it at the moment, with the hardest case being in the diverse areas, the really diverse areas. So the reason I had the first hypothesis, or I'm keen to test that, is because much of the literature on food prices has lumped together different forms of action. So riots, protests, and different types of kind of protests. Logically, I think food prices can help a lot of collective action problems across various different outcomes, types of unrest, sorry. But I think non-violence is crucially very difficult. I think it's much more difficult. And that's why I'm keen with the first hypothesis, is that it's not just saying that I'm confirming it at the subnational level, but I'm also confirming it for non-violent cases and mass non-violent cases, which perhaps are the hardest form of collective action. So I think that's what the first kind of hypothesis or test was trying to do. In terms of the second hypothesis, so about occurring in excluded areas, I think that's an absolutely excellent point. What I was trying to do is say that this is an additionally even harder area in these excluded areas which otherwise are best. So there's not actually any relationship between excluded areas and this form of protest, this mass form of protest. But when interacted with food prices, it does seem to show that it becomes more, opposition groups are more able to mobilize when otherwise it's difficult. I'm going to definitely have to look into your comment, and perhaps it is pointing to existing networks. Although these excluded areas, if they did have these kind of networks, then maybe they wouldn't need food prices. They wouldn't need food price increases. So you'd perhaps expect to see food prices. You'd perhaps expect to see these non-violent events, even regardless of whether food prices are high or low, if there's these pre-existing kind of networks. And I know ethnic groups, some ethnic groups do have strong kind of networks that facilitate certain kind of behaviours. I hope that kind of answers that second point. Yeah, I think that's everything.
So I want to just briefly add to that, and I want to give Kim a chance to put something on the table. She really hasn't had a chance to jump in yet. But one of the things you didn't address is one of the way that I reacted to Omar's comment about the structures. I thought was interesting because I also had an issue there. And for me, this is on page 3. I wrote, wait a second, aren't ethnic cleavages structures? So to me, this is a framing issue. I think both Omar and I are reacting. You seem to be arguing that this isn't a structural explanation, but it seems to I thought of it as one that yes, there's this shock, but the extent to which the shock has an effect depends on the structures, ethnic cleavages, and then the structures of networks like resource mobilization. So I'm not sure that you were trying to set up a contest between yourself and resource mobilization, but I was wondering that, and Omar seems to have read that. So if that wasn't your intention, then I think page 3 might be one of the places to look to make that a little bit different. And we may want to come back to this, but let's give Kim a chance to jump in.
Can I just respond to that quickly?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. So the wording in the paper is not, it's not my intention. And yeah, I think the way that the literature review at the moment is set up is problematic. It's not that I do consider these ethnic divisions or ethnic cleavages to be a structure, but a structure that constrains unrest, whereas the rest of the kind of literature on grievances argues the opposite for kind of violent conflicts, which makes sense. So I do consider it to be a structure. And I think other structures are really important as well. I do think opportunities are important. I do think resources are important, certainly. I'm not trying to say that they're not playing a role, but what I really want to get at is that these kind of ethnic cleavages could cut across certain resources or cut across certain opportunities. So there may be a perfect opportunity where the government's weak or there's divisions. You may have the resources in place. You may be in a city, you may have information resources there. But if there's divisions within society, this could constrain, even if them opportunities and resources are available, you might not be able to make use of them. So that's what I'm trying to get across, is not that they don't exist or matter, and I'm not trying to undermine them. I'm actually trying to build on top of them, that there's more to this story, if that makes sense. And my apologies if it's not clear in the paper. Yeah.
Kim?
Okay, so I think that you have a causal story, and I think if you're not trying to make that claim, you should be, because this seems like some pretty good causal logic that in putting more of that language in. I think that there are only a few fixable issues that you can do that I think people will come back and get you on if you don't. So the first that I think is kind of the biggest issue is kind of temporal proximity. So you're aggregating up to the year with your variables, and I mean that's what the literature does, but I think that there's some merit in trying to maybe do it at the monthly level, especially since you really want to show that the shock to food prices happens before the protest does. So I think your biggest issue with your data thus far is your control variables, and at least from what I've seen, there from like the Afrobarometer, that some survey questions that you can potentially use to maybe get at some of of the monthly stuff as well as the sub-national to test it there as well. So that's something to consider. If you keep it at the yearly level, I think including a lag or lagging your IVs gets at some temporal stuff, but still can be problematic because something might have happened in July and then the next event happens in April of the next year. So that doesn't seem to be very causally related. So I think that's the biggest problem. Another issue that you might face is omitted variable bias. I really hate bringing this up. I think that this is kind of a cheap shot, but I think that you at least have to address it, if not attempt with some more robustness checks to show that that's not the case. So a specific example is maybe like a natural disaster. So a natural disaster might cause a shock in food prices as well as influence some mobilization. So just to make sure that you're not grabbing that influence and maybe that indirect effect of food shocks. So I think those are the two biggest issues, and I think if you can address those, you can at least add some causal language without necessarily doing a potential outcomes framework and stuff like that. So I guess I can let you respond to that. And then.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, in terms of the first comment, yeah, it's definitely a concern about what comes first. So I have actually lagged all the independent variables and run models as a robustness check, and the results remain the same. Again, yeah, I agree. I don't think that's, that's, a necessarily the best kind of solution. So I'm definitely going to think about some other ways. If anybody has any suggestions on how to better capture that, I'd appreciate that. And in terms of the second point, yeah, again, I mean, one of the biggest drivers of food price increases could be droughts or too much rainfall, which can destroy crops, etc. I do actually include rainfall variation variables as a robust. It's not actually in the paper, but I've previously done it, so I think, yeah, I need to put it back in the paper. And it doesn't change the results or impact the results. Yeah, in either direction, whether there's relatively high or relatively lower rainfall. Yeah. Sorry, does everybody hear me?
Yep. Yeah. This is a small point, okay, Luke, but you, when you define food shocks, food price shocks, I was expecting a dichotomous, it either happened or it didn't kind of a coding, and you include the actual, if I followed it properly, the actual change in price, and so that seemed to me to be a bit of a disconnect. Am I following A, what you did, and B, because you could play with different thresholds. I mean, who knows what the threshold is, right? But you could try to defend one and then show that you can change the threshold around a little bit and show that the effect still matters. But so that was, in fact, and then I was surprised that you dichotomize your dependent variable. So I was expecting a dichotomy on the independent and not on, and like an event count or something like that on the dependent, and got the opposite. So again, that's not a huge deal, but I was curious if you'd given any thought to those issues, and am I properly understanding what you actually did?
Okay, yeah, yeah. So again, maybe it's a language issue. So basically, a shock would be the kind of higher food prices. So the way that the variable works is, you're basically expecting unrest as prices go up, for unrest to be more likely, and kind of no low increases or no increases. In terms of food prices, they generally do go up. So I think there's only a few examples where there's no kind of price increase in a year. So Yeah, I mean, I could play away.
But this is not a linear claim, right? It's not. It goes up a little, and the probability or the likelihood is going to shift the same amount if it goes up from. I mean, well, there's whatever normal inflation is, which people kind of adjust to outside of hyperinflation, right? And so it's going to go up. That's I guess what I mean is I'm thinking that food shocks are unusual, and that's why we use the word shock. And in your conceptual definition was what I was expecting, but your choice of measuring it. So have you actually tried it the other way? And if not, I would encourage you to mess around with some thresholds of, I have no idea because I don't know anything about food markets, but a 20% increase in 1 month I don't know, I would think that would be a lot, but I'm ignorant. But it would seem to me that there should be some thresholds you can play with, and then see if that, I would think your effects would be stronger. Maybe I'm wrong though.
Okay, I haven't looked at different thresholds. I mean, I basically used this variable because, the other two papers, the main paper that's in JPR has used this kind of, has used this variable where you expect, as prices go up, the risk goes up also. I think it's a very good point. There could be different thresholds. And it could be just interesting, and it could further validate what I'm saying. If it's above 10% or whether it's above 20%, where's the kind of point where unrest really starts to become likely? So I'd definitely take that on board and look at different thresholds. Thank you.
Okay, so as we're now kind of engaging with empirical strategy and research design, this is often for me the least exciting part of any kind of seminar dissection, but you've got to go through it. So forgive me, I'm gonna run through a number of things that occurred to me as I looked at your setup, empirical setup, and some of these may resonate with you more than others. But let me just start where Will just left off on at least the measurement of food prices. So one question I had is the use of food price indexes rather than looking at the price of a single food. Typically, for instance, in Africa, the staple of that particular country, whether it's sorghum or maize or cassava, because you're looking at indices. It's a basket of foods, and some of those, the elasticity of demand is going to be quite different within that basket of foods, right? So I do not know whether the ILO data allows you to disaggregate by the index, and no, okay, well then forget what I'm saying, then there's nothing you can do about it. But it will be a question mark about, you would expect the strongest reaction to a price than just an aggregate change across the average of these things. It's something that I've unfortunately had to learn something about, just because having engaged in consultancy work and having had to look at national agricultural surveys, the indices are unfortunately quite politicized within certain countries. In particular, when you start getting technical, it gets down to the weighting. So how much importance you attach to a particular food within this basket becomes a political decision. And I do not know the ILO data, but I would be surprised if they are standardized indices or whether they're actually relying on nationally set indices, which makes cross-national comparisons tricky. But I could be going into a level of detail that just is not interesting for you. I won't go further there, other than just to point out that that's a potential issue. Okay, bigger things. Okay, so let's just look at the models you've got for the moment. Some of these. Okay, so you've got a variable in there you've got two variables, one for included groups and one for excluded groups. It wasn't clear to me why you needed two variables. I thought it was simply a dummy variable, either included or excluded. I didn't quite understand why you had these two main effect variables in there for included and excluded, but there may be a very simple explanation for it. I've already mentioned that you don't seem to have the main effect for the diversity measure in there. You might also want to give people the full model, which has both interaction effects, if that is indeed the way you decide to present the paper testing those particular hypotheses. You're looking at rare events logistic regression. You should at least attempt to present one of the pseudo R-squared measures. There's a whole panoply out there to get some sense of how much of the variation is being explained by your variables. I know with logistic regressions, this is always a debate that never ends, but put it in there at least for the editor's satisfaction, and there'll be reviewer 3 will definitely ask you for it. I'm sure you of that. A log likelihood ratio test just to find out which model is superior. Enough on the models. Backing up before models, I would like to see some descriptive statistics just to help tell the story more clearly. At the very basic level, I'd like to know just how many events we're talking about in these in each of these different grid cell years, or whatever the unit exactly is of analysis. But grid descriptive statistics across all your variables actually would be very helpful. It tells the story more clearly, and it becomes so much harder to interpret interaction effects in logistic regressions in particular. You may want to consider standardizing the variables too. There are programs that allow you to do this for logistic regression if you're using Stata, so we can at least know what the relative substantive effect of these variables are, because it's so hard whether you're using particularly interaction terms where you have different units of measurement to be able to interpret it. It's really, really, really tricky. So standardization would be one way to kind of help readers be able to interpret the relative importance of your variable. So descriptive statistics, models, measurement. So I already talked about food prices. You've already talked about how you measured diversity, so I won't go there. Oh yeah, using the grid method, I totally see the advantages of it. You know, administrative boundary changes is a nightmare for any kind of cross-national researcher. You know, they just change, and they're endogenous to political and economic variables. So that obviously solves this issue. But you at least need to have in your data section an explanation of how you code grid cells that have country borders in them. So what happens if you have a food price shock in a grid cell that is obviously on one side of the border, but there might be a mobilization on the other side of the border, or I don't know what other variables you might code that grid cell for, but how do you assign, basically how do you assign that particular grid cell? So I'm sure you have a method, maybe it's just, you know, halfway point or something, but at least explain to us what your coding decision was there, because otherwise you're going to end up with some very odd results indeed. Robustness checks, I think we need to see a correlation matrix and some basic collinearity checks. If you can, I think you can with this particular data set for the dependent variable, try to disaggregate the dependent variable, because at the moment you lump together strikes with demonstrations. Now strikes are a much harder thing to organize because they require a hell of a lot more planning and premeditation. So I'd be curious to see if you were to disaggregate it, so you're looking at strikes, which is a much harder test of organization, whether the results hold. If it holds with strikes, then you've got something going on about the ability to, about the importance of organization here. Okay, let me stop. That's enough on, it's not exciting to go through these things, but let me just stop, and you don't have to respond to them. They're just things for you to think about.
I have a couple of responses. No, I really appreciate that. They're all absolutely excellent comments. Okay, so in terms of why there's included and excluded variable, is because not all grids have an ethnic group. So the reference category is actually no grids, if that makes sense. So that's why both variables are in there. Yeah, they're all excellent comments. In terms of the boundaries at the borders, that's right to bring up. It's a real difficult one, because the way that the PRIO grid codes it, in terms of what grid gets assigned to what country, is if at least, you know, over 50% of that grid falls within a country, then it goes within that country and not the other country. It's largely not that problematic because non-violence doesn't tend to occur in cities which are away from borders. It is problematic in the DRC with Kinshasa, and I should have put this in the paper. So I've looked at the data, and so it actually, where Kinshasa is, it actually goes under Brazzaville, which is obviously a problem. But then looking at the grids around that grid, they're very identical to the grid where you would want Kinshasa to be. And that's partly because the way the kind of subnational data generally works is the grids are generally bigger. So the population estimates are over 4 grids. So Kinshasa's spread across 4 grids. So I've been very careful to make sure, and I've basically moved it to a neighboring grid, which is within the country. And I've been very careful to make sure that all the conditions are exactly the same to avoid that. Another example is Bangui in Kar. The other problem on the border with the DRC. Again, moving it to the west is exactly the same kind of conditions that are present. So I've been very careful with that, and it's problematic, but I've thought about that a lot, and yeah, I don't think it doesn't make much difference when the grids are the same. I agree with all the other comments. Well, actually, with strikes, I think that's a very good point. The problem is, so, in the paper I've come up with estimates to try and overcome the fact that some of the data is not geocoded adequately. A lot of them are strikes, so I'm not sure I'm able to disaggregate strikes because, there's going to be big problems with bias with strikes in particular. But yeah, I can have a look anyway and then see what comes of it. But I'm very, a bit skeptical about doing that. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Good, Omar. So Luke, I want to raise something we haven't talked about that I think is a theoretical fly in the ointment, and it has to do with H2B, the third hypothesis. You start talking about it on page 11, and in the margin at that, I wrote, yes, I'm with you, I'm good, but why is that connected to food prices, right? So why is it, so I felt like the connection of food prices wasn't strong, but you address that much more directly in the, on the next page. You're talking about Brinkman and Hendricks, and but then you bring up something that I hadn't yet thought about, but should have been, which is how states differentially respond in terms of, what does it mean to be excluded, and that they that states make choices over whether or not to distribute these shocks to everyone or not, and that, if I'm understanding properly, is unmeasured. Your empirical work doesn't take into account. I mean, it seems to me what you're effectively having to argue is that as long as a group's excluded, then policies like the Ghanaian government you describe don't exist, right? Or does that make any sense, or am I misunderstanding? Or is it just, yeah, sure, that there is that Ghanaian, but they're the only government that does it. That's not, these food prices hit everybody, rather than just being concentrated differentially among some groups in some countries and not in others. Are you supposed to really put a fine point on it? Don't you need to have some measure in your model of the different ways in which countries distribute the effects of the shock?
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to measure how governments kind of respond. I mean, the most simplest kind of answer to that is most governments don't have a very good response, particularly in Africa. So even during the really high prices of 2011, very few countries in Africa actually introduced some sort of policy to dampen the effect of food prices. So some sort of subsidies or some sort of social security kind of policies. Very few, even with the highest prices. So yeah, I don't think it's that much of a problem. I think what I'm trying to get at there is kind of perception. There could be unfairness, a perception of unfairness, particularly again the language is looking at it again the language is not quite there. But I think basically what I'm trying to get at is it's more of a perception that there's unfairness in society based on how the distribution to different groups is already kind of unequal economically, politically. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. But in terms of, so it's more subjective. I mean, in terms of objectively, I can't really measure that, and there's not that much kind of policy intervention. I have tried to look at.
By perceptions, you mean grievances, right?
Sorry.
That's tying back to the grievances, right?
Perceived grievances. Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, now as you're talking, I'm starting to poke a hole in my own critique. And please remind me, are the food prices measured at the grid level? Do they actually vary at the grid level, or do the food prices, are they national?
So it's unfortunate. The food prices are national.
I assume they had to be, but it occurred to me that if they weren't, then my critique was off. But okay.
Yeah, so I mean that raises a good point as well. There is some subnational data coming through on food prices. Unfortunately, it's in some countries it doesn't exist. In some countries, spatially, it's just not available. In others, there's loads of data. But the biggest problem is it's largely only available in the last couple of years, which doesn't kind of help me out. So in the paper, I've tried to show that there's kind of less variation across cities.
Go back to Omar making a suggestion, whether they're shallow case studies or vignettes, or you end up developing a more full-blown type of effort, whether as part of this paper or if this becomes part of a larger project, perhaps. But some of that subnational data might be really helpful there, right? Because now you don't need the coverage if you can actually really probe some of these, because you can learn, once you get to a particular, set of villages or urban area, some grid that's where a lot more about mobilization and about the distribution of ethnic groups, and so if you focused attention and trying to think about cases in places where you knew you actually had some local prices, then you might be able to start coming up with some interesting, comparisons.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Going back to potential policies, I have tried to look at urban-rural bias.
Right.
That may pick up on kind of richer or poorer groups, urban groups tend to be relatively richer. It's not always the case. I don't really find too much impact in terms of rural-urban bias. Unfortunately, the data is quite limited as well. It's only available for half of the countries, so I can't fully kind of test types of policy and whether they're unequal or not. Yeah, Omar, sorry.
Kim, did you have any theoretical or conceptual, or for that matter, other issues you haven't had a chance to put on the table yet?
So I agree with a lot of what you said. I think you've covered a lot of my conceptual stuff. Yeah, I think the biggest issue that I had was just this idea of cross-cutting, which I've already said, and kind of getting into some of that. So.
Okay, Omar.
Yeah. just picking up on the cross-cutting thing. So there is this very old literature, obviously, on cross-cutting cleavages that goes all the way back to Rokan and Lipset from the 1970s, and it's come back recently. Joel Selway has brought cross-cuttingness back into operational political science, and he's actually developed measures to allow you to do this. One note of caution, though, is that when we're talking about cross-cutting cleavages versus reinforcing cleavages, we are talking about cleavages, right? So it's about where you have ethnicity versus language, or ethnicity versus religion, or ethnicity versus class. So here, it's not necessarily, you have ethnicity, which clearly is a cleavage, but then the other dimension is I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's, you know, it's the response to a food price. That's not a cleavage, it's momentary. So I just urge you to think carefully about adopting the language of cross-cuttingness, because it will immediately make people think about the classic cross-cuttingness literature that Selway and others are now, you know, reviving. Okay, but that's an aside. I actually wanted to follow up on what, Will, you were talking about, and more broadly, I see this as the need to justify the symmetry assumption, the symmetric effect of a food price shock across included and excluded groups, because that's a big assumption. And Will has rightly, I think, questioned that assumption by pointing to the role of the regime in redistributing the effects of a food price shock to ensure that it would go, you would expect, to minimize the effect on its supporters, so it's ethnic, co-ethnics or ethnically included groups, and often, in fact, it's an urban-rural thing where you basically take money, you take food out of the rural areas, you ship it into the urban areas. This is Bates's classic work. It's the urban bias, because you need to appease your urban constituents, because they're the ones who are most likely to be able to mobilize, and because coordination is so easy, and bring the regime down. So you're more likely to, you know, rural areas is much harder to mobilize. So you do need to have some thought about the role of the state in mediating the effect of a food price shock. So how to do that? Okay, easy to identify the problem. Well, one way, let me think this through. One way may be to distinguish shocks that are within the government's control to create and remedy, and those which are not. So you could have government-created and escalated shocks because they might set a price, or they might restrict the supply. Or you could have a natural shock, like a more exogenous shock, as it were, because, you know, that's more endogenous, what I was talking about before. But a more exogenous shock, as Kim was talking about, like a drought or some kind of natural event. And to distinguish between those two types of shock and see if indeed, if it is a government-made shock, then its ability to mediate its effect, to redistribute, as Will talked about, is obviously going to be quite high, but it may be that role might be weaker for a drought which affects the entire country, and then this is beyond the control of the government. So then the symmetry assumption becomes more defensible when faced with that kind of shock. Okay, that was my idea.
I just want to jump in very quickly and let you know, Luke, that I made an effort to get Bob Bates involved on this one, but you know, sometimes people can, and a lot of times they can't. But I'm also right. This brings up Amartya Sen's, you know, argument in terms of famine, which is a much more extreme version, right? But the just strengthening the state's role. So that's I think that Omar's articulated very nicely these sort of cloudy ideas I had in my head, and I don't know that R3 is necessarily going to come up with that, but I think it's something worth kicking around. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's a very good point, and I have thought about this a lot over the last couple of months, definitely, and it's quite tricky to get at this issue. So yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced it's kind of state-induced, or that the state has that much control. Simply, you know, as I said before, when prices did go sky high, very few governments actually intervened. I'm not really sure why. I mean, it's quite possible because maybe they were not capable. I'm not too sure. Yeah, I'm not sure it's state-induced. I mean, with the food prices, they're basically based on market mechanisms.
State-induced is definitely.
Is it?
If I may interrupt, that state-induced is definitely too strong. But I think the question, I mean, I like the way you phrase it, right? Does the state actually have control? Those are the ideal, right, exogenous, where the state wants to try to intervene, but it really can't. That would seem to best strengthen your asymmetric. And I think this ties back potentially, well, actually, I think it does tie back to, you know, you used the phrase sky high, and to me that suggests, again, a binary measure. Like sky high is, I don't know exactly what the threshold is, but it's above something, right? And so, you know, maybe there's leverage to be gained. I mean, you know, back to Kim's suggestion, you know, about that Omar echoed about, you know, something like natural disaster or drought that the government can't control, but also, you know, international prices. I mean, there are, you know, whether, and I don't know if about these markets, if these are arbitrage induced or, you know, whatever, but and again, perhaps as a case study, you know, so that you don't have to fuss with it over the entire period. If data just aren't available, maybe you can gain some leverage on a few events where, you know, there was some arbitrage that, you know, just none of those governments really could respond. And, you know, and so do you find, you know, more of an effect there? I mean, I suppose you could even try to dummy that if you could identify just that, you know, these are the food shocks, and then these are the ones where we know that, you know, market actors were driving it and governments had no control. I don't know if any of those ideas actually play out, but does it seem to be consistent with this idea of symmetry?
Yeah, yeah, they're very good comments. I'm gonna have to definitely dig deeper and think about this a bit more. In terms of, you know, yeah, I mean, definitely if the government is getting involved in some way, then, you know, it may not be impacting everybody. Yeah, so definitely I'm going to look deeper and try and justify this more. And definitely international prices are in there as well. I think they're playing a different role. Yeah, basically I don't really have a better answer than what I have at the moment.
No, that's great. Well, we've been a small group, but we've done a good job coming up. At least I hope you think. My reaction is a lot of great comments on a really interesting paper that, you know, as most of like the really good work that, you know, that we do always suggest other projects, and I certainly think that's there. To close us off, we got a couple of minutes left. Luke, would you like to ask, is there anything you'd like to get feedback from us on that we haven't commented on, or anything you'd like to direct our way?
Okay, one of the concerns that I have had is the kind of estimation of some of the data. So some of the data is not geocoded. I think I explained this relatively well in a paper that it's around a third of the events, and, you know, I can't simply take them out because they're very important events. I mean, for example, some of them are anti-apartheid events, exactly what I'm trying to get at. if they're excluded, then I'm inducing bias. But my way around it is I'm trying to come up with a sensible solution. But that's also inducing bias. So I just one of the concerns I have is this kind of method of having different estimations of where they might occur, these non-geocoded events, i.e. in certain cities or producing areas, etc. Is that a good kind of solution?
I have to confess that where is that discussed? I managed to gloss over that. Right, for which I
the
apologize.
research design?
Do you know the page number? 15, no? 14. Does anybody else have a different?
Yeah, well, so I also didn't think of this. I didn't notice this as a major issue, but clearly you're highlighting it. It's something to think about. Can you impute locations to these events? Okay, is that what you're asking? Is that a defensible strategy? Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many events we're talking about here. If it's a feasible number and there's secondary sources out there, you don't have to rely on the data set that you've got. But if there are secondary sources out there that might allow you to make educated guesses about where to impute these events in terms of location, then that's a methodologically defensible solution. So if it is feasible, if we're not talking thousands of events, if we're talking like a handful, then okay, maybe you can do this.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's on page 12. Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. It's an issue.
I would say definitely highlight it more, unless you're hoping that R3 doesn't notice it, in which case you're doing current presentations. I mean, that's always the trade-off, right? But so we can ignore like how much you highlighted in your paper for the moment and just just think about the issue. If what you're doing is so one option, of course, is imputing in some way. Another one, and I don't know if this is what you were doing, but perhaps you sound like you might have been hinting at it, that I've always thought we ought to see people do, especially as computers give us better ability to do it, would be to say, okay, there's a finite set of places these events might be, and I can simulate them. And I mean, that's a big simulation project, but I think it would be cool and actually look at the distribution of, to what extent so you end up getting a distribution of results depending on where they were assigned, preferably not exactly randomly, right? But plausibly in some sense. But that's a methods sort of project on its own. I mean, if what I just said made any sense, that'd be an awful lot to ask in a paper.
Okay, yeah, I do actually come up with different estimates of where they're likely to occur. So based on what's geocoded.
How do you don't show us, you only show us one set of results.
Okay, so in the results, I actually, I run all the kind of models across the different specifications, across the different estimates, and then without estimates to try and get around this issue. So, I mean, 93% of the cases are occurring in urban areas. So, pretty sure that, a lot of these ungeocoded events are occurring in urban areas, and that's the assumption I make.
Gotcha.
And I basically have different specifications for, it's basically nationwide events. So definitely know that they're occurring in at least 2 cities across the country. Definitely know that that's happening, but where they are, there's just simply no information. So I make different specifications, or maybe say 10 cities, 5 cities. I take the estimates out as well, just to see if the results remain the same.
Everybody who works with that data set is going to know this issue.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, a few people I know are also having the same problem. And it's not just SCAD data, it's any kind of events data. It's very difficult with some events to know who are occurring. Okay, I realise I've probably kind of pushed this over time, but it was just.
That's okay. There is no good solution, and I think this is a good area for active research. I mean, as Omar suggests, but this is now methodological research, right? So we've got, we can think of it as a missing data problem, we can think about however we want to think about it. I think what you're doing is, it's not great, but it is as defensible as any of the other not great things I can think of. And, we understand what you ultimately want to show is that your results are robust to lots of different decisions, right? And that's why I think ultimately really building simulations that allow us to really figure out what the space was. But I don't know of anyone who's done that, and that's complicated work. And so I would say sally forth with what you've got, see how people respond and what specific alternatives they offer, and move forward from that. Kim or Omar, any last comment on that?
Only to say that this, despite the fact that you've got so many ideas for how you could improve the paper, just to say that you still have an interesting question and an important contribution to make to our knowledge. So to persevere with it and not throw your hands up and think, oh my God, there's just so many missing things or so many moving parts with this project, I couldn't possibly get it down to anything that's publishable. Far from it. This process, making sausages from the inside of from the butcher's perspective, I still like eating sausages. So I'm looking forward to the sausage. So keep at it.
So just to kind of reiterate, I agree with Omar that if you don't have a lot of cases, this will be easy to impute, especially if you just look at some other sources of event counts and maybe get an idea of that, and it's very easy to code it to where it does it automatically and you don't necessarily have to go through it by hand. So maybe even if it's a number of cases, it wouldn't be hard to do. And I can email you some sources that I have if you're interested. But yeah, I think you have a really good idea, and I look forward to seeing where this goes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Omar. That was well put, and I want to echo that. And with that, I will go ahead and bring us to a close. I want to thank both Kim and Omar for jumping in and taking the time. You get no benefits from this other than being a part of the community.
No, I definitely feel I got benefited from it. I got to meet all of you guys, first of all, and I get to hear how you guys look at problems. I actually, it's the main reason why I thought to participate in this. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I look forward to the next time I get to participate.
Great. All right. Well, we rely on everybody else, Christian and I, doing this, and Luke for sending in papers. So just thanks to everybody.
Yeah, and thank you for taking the time to read the paper. Read my paper.
Be well, everybody.
See you. Bye now.